A friend of mine the other day told me that she was preparing to go to a very important church business meeting. So I asked her what was so important about it, and she said that the pastor had stood in the pulpit on Sunday and admitted that he had presented for the last 2 years, almost verbatim, sermons from internet sources. Um, I was amazed. I had never come across anyone who had committed pulpit plagiarism. I wouldn't even consider it. I pastored and preached for several years and always felt like it was absolutely my purpose and duty to hear God, receive the text and the understanding of the word for the people directly from God. I understand, and I think all preachers understand, that we must use sources, that we must go find examples and quotes and information, and maybe we might even hear other preachers present ideas that we want to pass on to our hearers. So I understand that, but to just intentionally steal someone else's work was amazing to me. And that's what it is. It's stealing. The eighth commandment of God says, "Thou shalt not steal." And if we can't trust the ethics and integrity of the men and women who stand in the pulpit to preach, how can we expect the congregants to have integrity and ethics? So I think that this is a huge issue. The standard of behavior that we are presented with in academic work comes from a paper from the College of Agricultural Studies, written in 2005 and repeated in our reading this week. And it's the quotation from that paper is, "The standard of behavior meant to ensure that work done is one's own work and that the work of others is properly recognized." That makes sense to me. Pulpit plagiarism was defined by Scott Gibson, who is the director of the Center for Preaching at the Gordon Cornwell Theological Seminary, is defined as preaching someone else's sermon, research, or content without giving public credit for it. I like this part of the quote. It is covert appropriation without overt appreciation. And that's the point. When we use materials from other people, quotes, examples, etc., we have an obligation to give that citation, give that information to our hearers. I don't think that there's a big difference between academic and pulpit plagiarism. I think that essentially they're both a question of ethics and integrity, of honesty. And obviously, this is wrong. I do think that there is a difference between academic and pulpit plagiarism in the fact that I think it's probably pretty easy to unintentionally fall into some elements of plagiarism in pulpit ministry. When we are speaking, when we are preaching, we kind of get in the flow. And as we are presenting our material, sometimes examples will rise up in our minds, or thoughts will rise up in our minds, or quotations that we have absorbed from other sources. And we may give those without proper recognition because we don't remember the source, because we don't remember that it wasn't our original thought. And so we find that we can accidentally fall into plagiarism, but intentional plagiarism, we know it. And the point is, we have to understand that it is an ethics and integrity issue and the honesty issue, and not think that it's acceptable to borrow other people's material and present it as our own. I think that we have to understand that intentional plagiarism, the way to guard against it, the first and primary way to guard against intentional plagiarism is to refuse to turn to sources until we have received or determined our text and our basic premise of the message from God, and then use sources and apply information, studies, that tools available on the internet so that we can round out and complete our sermon. Pastor H.B. Charles Jr. wrote an article, How to Avoid Pulpit Plagiarism. And the quote I like the most out of his article is this: milk a lot of cows, but churn your own butter. And I think that's the essential point. We must give credit where credit is due. As we use examples, as we use information, I think it's beneficial. It adds authority and weight to our words when we give credit to those that agree with us, that we've used their material, that are quotations that make sense. If we give credit where credit is due, we are actually increasing trust with our hearers because they know that we live in integrity. And we are also increasing their thoughts of other people, sometimes well-known names and famous people, who agree with our thoughts and who are supporting the very premise that we are providing. All of us are preaching from the same Bible. You know, we're all using the same stories and the same basic tenets of the word. So I think that it's beneficial to give credit when quotes are used or information or thoughts are used. And I think it lends authority to our words. I want to give you an understanding of the law of minimal attribution. This is presented by John Rotman, professor of preaching at Calvin Theological Seminary, and he states, the words or ideas borrowed from a sermon should be cited as belonging to someone else, but the citation should be as modest as possible so as not to detract from the sermon. Basically, he is saying that we don't necessarily have to give the name, but we do have to give recognition that we have received this information or borrowed this information from another. Sometimes our sources are not well known or recognized, and no one would know that name if we gave it. But we do need to be ethical in giving credit to another, that it's not our original thought. And so first and foremost, I think, is if we seek from God our thoughts and our information first, that's the most important guard against committing plagiarism in the pulpit. But Chris Barnett, Associate Dean of Christian Studies at Anderson University, offers a couple other simple ideas. One he suggests is if your church uses a weekly bulletin, then print those citations in the bulletin. Therefore, everyone can look them up. Everyone can know that you have used material from other sources. Another suggestion he makes is that if you use overhead projectors, you might give the citation on that overhead projector even as you are preaching, so that people recognize where the source is. I think the most important thing to understand is that genuine recognition of our sources and our inspiration will go a long way to build trust with our listeners and increase their respect for our integrity and our honesty. We must be the first line of defense against dishonesty, against stealing of other people's materials. How can we expect our congregations to live in integrity if we fail to live in integrity ourselves?